Spring 1945. The Third Reich was crumbling, and across Europe, convoys of prisoners trudged along dusty roads. Among them were German women nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries pulled from the ruins of hospitals and command centers. The air was thick with dust as American trucks replaced the cattle cars, their engines groaning under the weight of uniforms and weary bodies. For many of these women, this was the first time they were being transported not by the Wehrmacht, but by their enemy. They sat stiffly, bracing themselves for cruelty with every jolt of the vehicle. Their minds replayed the propaganda films they had seen, the warnings that capture meant humiliation, starvation, or worse. Some clutched small handbags, the last vestiges of civilian life, while others wore field-gray jackets that hung loosely on their thin shoulders. As the convoy rolled westward, each passing mile deepened their dread of what lay ahead. The numbers told a grim story. By May 1945, American forces held an estimated 370,000 German prisoners of war, many of them women. They were processed in large groups, their paperwork stamped in hurried offices, then dispersed across a vast network of transit camps. Some whispered prayers, others muttered curses under their breath. All of them carried the same unspoken question, asterisk, when will the hunger start again? Asterisk. Inside the trucks, silence hung heavy. The air was filled with the scent of sweat and dust. A few dared to glance at the young American soldiers seated at the edges, rifles resting across their knees. The GIs avoided eye contact, staring at the road as if the distance could dissolve the tension between captor and captive. One woman later wrote in her diary, asterisk, we expected them to starve us, asterisk, that fear weighed on them more than the steel frames of the trucks. When the convoy finally slowed, the silhouette of fences appeared on the horizon. Barbed wire stretched tightly, guard towers rising against the sky. At first sight, it seemed to confirm every nightmare they had been told. Yet beyond the gates, something unexpected awaited. The camp was not a muddy trench, not a dungeon. Instead, neat rows of wooden barracks stood in orderly lines, their roofs patched, windows intact. The sight of such order cut through the chaos they had left behind in Germany. This first impression was just the beginning. What waited beyond the barbed wire would upend everything they feared. The truck stopped, dust settled, boots crunched on gravel, and commands rang out in English. The German women climbed down, their limbs stiff from hours of travel. Ahead, the barbed wire framed a compound that should have confirmed their worst imaginings. Yet what caught their attention was not decay, but structure. Barracks stood in straight lines, their roofs solid wooden steps recently repaired. Even the gravel paths seemed carefully maintained, as if meant for guests, not prisoners. They shuffled past a watchtower where a single GI stood guard, his rifle slung casually. There were no snarling dogs, no shouted insults. Instead, a clerk at a folding desk checked their names against typed lists. The precision felt foreign. The Germany they had fled was burning. Here, under enemy control, there was calm, routine. Some women exchanged glances, struggling to reconcile what they saw with the horrors they had imagined. Across the United States, more than 500 prisoner camps had been established by 1945, stretching from New England to the Deep South. Oklahoma alone held several thousand captives in sprawling compounds surrounded by farmland. This particular camp had a strangely pastoral feel, its barracks arranged like a small village. Some reports mentioned flower beds planted by earlier prisoners, splashes of color breaking the monotony of the wooden walls. To the women, these details struck harder than any guard's order. One auxiliary murmured, asterisk, "It looks cleaner than our homes." Asterisk. The remark carried a bitter truth. After years of bombing and shortages, many German towns had been reduced to rubble. Here, in captivity, the air smelled of pine and fresh earth, not smoke and ash. The comfort was unsettling, a dissonance that soothed and disturbed at the same time. The Americans led them into an open yard for roll call. A whistle blew, numbers were counted, and silence stretched. Beyond the wire, fields stretched endlessly, untouched by war. Some women stared through the fences, wondering if freedom lay just a few steps away. But the structure of camp life was already settling around them. This was only the beginning. Soon they would be assigned bunks, led into barracks, and introduced to routines that would challenge everything they believed about captivity. The next surprise came not with orders or guards, but with warmth and water. The barracks doors swung open, revealing not damp, dark interiors, but a low building where steam curled against tin roofs. The guards gestured, their English clipped and firm. Inside, rows of shower stalls waited. For a moment, the women hesitated. Memories of rumors and threats flooded back. In Nazi camps, showers carried sinister connotations. Here, the water ran clear, hot, and real. One by one, they stepped beneath it, shivering not from cold but disbelief. Buckets of soap were passed around, thick bars stamped with American insignias. Some women clutched the soap like treasure, breathing in the sharp scent of lye and lavender, smells absent from war-torn Germany. The guards looked away, offering what privacy they could, leaving the prisoners to wash away years of grime and fear. The water carried away more than dirt. It stripped away fragments of their old identities. Reports from the International Red Cross noted that prisoners in U.S. camps were allowed 2 to 3 showers per week, a luxury unimaginable in the collapsing Reich. Lice were combed out, hair was cut, and fresh linens were laid on bunks. For women who had gone months without a proper bath, the sting of soap in their eyes felt like both pain and deliverance. The silence in the shower room was broken only by dripping water and the occasional muffled sob. One auxiliary whispered later, asterisk, "Our own officers never gave us this." Asterisk. The words carried shame and shock. In the Wehrmacht, women had often been treated as replaceable, sent into collapsing hospitals and field offices with little regard for their well-being. Yet here, in enemy hands, hygiene was enforced not as punishment, but as routine. The contradiction was undeniable. When the showers ended, their old uniforms were collected for laundering. Thick, clean, American-issued towels were handed out. The women wrapped themselves in fabric that felt impossibly soft compared to the rough wool they had worn for years. Some lingered, reluctant to part with the warmth. Others held the towels tightly, as if afraid this small kindness might be taken away. Outside, quartermasters had stacked piles of clothing, jackets, and boots. The shock of cleanliness was only the prelude. Soon, the women would discover that even their attire would be transformed by captivity. When they stepped back into the yard, damp-haired and raw-skinned, they found bundles of clothing stacked on wooden crates. American quartermasters shouted orders, pointing to piles of uniforms made from U.S. Army surplus. The garments smelled of starch and storage, a stark contrast to the sweat-soaked German field gray they had worn for years. Each woman received a jacket, Trousers, shirt, and boots, standard issue, designed for men, nothing feminine about them. A strange moment. They pulled on the oversized jackets. The transformation felt surreal. Sleeves hung past their wrists, belts tightened around their waists, and boots clumped against the gravel. The effect was almost comical, yet the atmosphere was solemn. They had been stripped of their old insignia, the uniforms that had symbolized their authority and service. Now, clad in the fabric of their enemy, they looked like neither soldiers nor civilians, but something in between. The weight of this shift pressed silently on their posture. The numbers revealed the scale. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps distributed thousands of sets of surplus uniforms to incoming prisoners across hundreds of camps. This efficiency reflected industrial power, warehouses overflowing with fabrics, leather, and boots. For German women who had seen their homeland ration soap and tear curtains into makeshift clothes, the abundance was overwhelming. Some muttered under their breath, unable to reconcile captivity with the sheer volume of goods the Americans treated as disposable. One nurse whispered, asterisk, "We looked like soldiers again, but not ours." Asterisk. Her words captured a deeper truth. The uniforms erased their former roles, making them equal not as Germans, but as captives, all dressed in the same anonymous olive drab. The irony was sharp. They had served a regime that glorified hierarchy and symbols, yet now stood in blank uniformity, clad in foreign cloth. They adjusted their belts and rolled up their sleeves. A new feeling crept in, unease, mixed with reluctant comfort. The fabric was warm, the boots sturdy, the pockets deep. Some women admitted, if only to themselves, that these clothes were better made than what they had been issued back home. The contradiction lingered, raising unspoken comparisons between the crumbling Reich and the logistical machine that had defeated it. The greatest surprise was still to come. Quartermasters directed them toward another line, where crates marked with red crosses waited. Inside were packages that would stun them more than the uniforms ever could. The line moved toward stacks of crates, each stamped with a red cross and stenciled lettering. Guards pried them open with bayonets, revealing neatly packed parcels. The women watched, uncertain. Supply boxes in Germany had always meant rations, but always in short supply, always less than promised. Here, the parcels seemed endless. Each was the size of a small suitcase, heavy with unknown contents. One by one, the women were handed their own, the weight surprising in their arms. When they tore the seals, the shock was immediate. Inside lay treasures, tins of Spam, blocks of chocolate, powdered milk, even coffee. Cigarettes were wrapped in crisp paper, stacked like currency. To women who had watched German civilians scrape crumbs from bombed-out bakeries, this felt unreal. The scent of cocoa and tobacco filled the air, overwhelming the dusty yard. Some clutched the chocolate to their chests as if it were gold. Others simply stared, unable to believe such luxuries existed during wartime. The numbers told the story of abundance. Records show that in a single month, 24,000 Red Cross parcels were distributed to prisoners in U.S. custody. Each weighed around 11 pounds, a compact symbol of American supply lines that stretched across oceans. Where Germany struggled to feed its civilians, the enemy could flood even its captives with goods. The disparity was painful. One auxiliary whispered bitterly, asterisk. Even German civilians had nothing like this, asterisk. It was not just envy, it was disbelief. For years, propaganda had painted Americans as greedy, wasteful, and barbaric. Yet here, in the hands of prisoners, were foodstuffs that felt like peacetime luxuries. The contradiction unraveled everything they thought they knew. The guards watched their reactions with quiet interest. To them, this was procedure, routine distribution. To the women, it was a seismic shift in perception. Some immediately traded cigarettes for favors or swapped coffee for extra blankets. Others hid their parcels under bunks, afraid this abundance might vanish as suddenly as it appeared. The taste of chocolate on their tongues was almost overwhelming, a reminder of a civilian life buried under rubble. Among the canned goods and tobacco, something stranger emerged. In one parcel, a slim cardboard box rattled faintly. A woman pried it open and gasped. Inside, nestled carefully, was not food or medicine, but a tube of deep red lipstick. The sight drew laughter from the guards and stunned silence from the women. The small box trembled in her palm. She tipped it, and the tube slid out, its shiny metal casing twisting open to reveal a vivid red tip. Lipstick. For a long moment, they simply stared. This was not sustenance, not clothing, not survival. It was something entirely different, a reminder of femininity buried under years of uniforms and hunger. A young GI chuckled, muttering asterisk. Girls need it too. Asterisk before moving on. The absurdity of the moment broke against the silence. Hands reached out hesitantly. One woman brushed the color against her wrist, a streak of red blooming on her pale skin. Gasps followed. Another turned the tube in the sunlight, the creamy surface catching the rays through the barbed wire. The guards seemed amused, but for the women, the impact was profound. Lipstick had vanished from German stores years earlier. Factories that once made cosmetics had been converted to produce ammunition. Here, in captivity, luxury returned, not through mercy, but through sheer logistical excess. The numbers underscored the shock. The U.S. wartime economy poured billions into production, and cosmetics were no exception. Millions of tubes of lipstick rolled off American assembly lines, both for civilians and for morale kits issued to service women. The surplus was so vast that even prisoner parcels could include such items without notice. For women raised in scarcity, the idea was almost incomprehensible. One nurse whispered, asterisk, "We had not seen lipstick in years," asterisk. Her voice wavered between awe and sorrow. Some prisoners recoiled, thinking it frivolous in the middle of war. Others clutched the tubes tightly, as if reclaiming a stolen part of themselves. The red color contrasted sharply with their ill-fitting olive-drab uniforms, a splash of life against fabric that had erased their roles as women. In those small sticks lay a dangerous, intoxicating memory of self. Lipstick also sparked divisions. Younger auxiliaries laughed nervously, eager to try it. Older women frowned, dismissing it as weakness. Guards leaned on the fence, curious to see which side would prevail. For the first time in captivity, arguments flared, not over food or shelter, but over something as delicate as cosmetics. Still, the allure was undeniable. That evening, one prisoner dared to apply a careful line across her lips, using the reflection of a dented tin plate. A face stared back, one she had lost to war. Yet this rediscovered self would not stay hidden for long. Soon, even shards of glass would become mirrors, amplifying the shock of color in a world drained of it. Night settled over the camp, the hum of insects filling the air. Inside one of the barracks, a prisoner crouched by her bunk, holding a shard of broken glass no larger than her palm. She lifted it toward her face, her hands trembling. In the dim light of a single bulb, she traced the lipstick across her lips, uneven but bold. The reflection staring back was unfamiliar, half soldier, half woman, caught between war and memory. For a long moment, she simply looked, rediscovering herself in silence. Others gathered, whispering in disbelief. The shard passed from hand to hand, each woman testing the red smear against her mouth or cheek. Their laughter was quiet, nervous, as if the guards might punish them for vanity. But no orders came. Instead, the barracks filled with the faint scent of wax and perfume, alien in a place built for control. It was a quiet rebellion, carried out in whispers and stolen moments. Evidence from photographs and diaries shows that prisoners often hid such items, tucking cosmetics into mattress seams or beneath floorboards. In this camp, the lipstick became a secret ritual, shared only among those who dared. Some prisoners even used beet juice or boot polish to extend the illusion, desperate to preserve this fragile return of dignity. These small acts stood in stark contrast to the rigid statistics of captivity, one guard for every 30 to 40 prisoners, routines impersonal and strict. One German auxiliary later recalled, "It felt like dignity returning." The line captures the paradox. Captivity had taken their freedom, yet lipstick restored a fragment of self long denied by both war and their own regime. The red lines across their faces glowed faintly in the barracks light, symbols not of surrender, but of survival. Yet even this fragile ritual carried risks. Rivalries brewed. Who would hold the mirror longest? Who deserved the first swipe of color? Old hierarchies reasserted themselves, senior nurses pressing claims over younger auxiliaries. Tension simmered, echoing the chain of command they thought they had escaped. For a few hours, the camp became a stage for petty contests, as if lipstick mattered more than bread. The guards noticed. They stood outside the barracks, leaning on their rifles, watching with a mix of curiosity and amusement. To them, it was harmless. To the women, it was everything. Soon, those rivalries would break into arguments that even the Americans could not ignore. By the second week, the novelty of lipstick gave way to something sharper competition. Inside the barracks, whispers turned into heated exchanges. Senior nurses, once used to rank and respect, insisted they should be the first to use the parcels. Younger auxiliaries, hardened by frontline chaos, pushed back with equal force. The barracks crackled with tension as the tiny ritual of cosmetics became a battleground for authority. It was no longer just about survival. It was about who controlled fragments of dignity. One evening, the disputes erupted into shouting. A lipstick tube changed hands too many times, and a scuffle broke out on the wooden floor. Guards rushed in, rifles slung, fingers off triggers, watching the women claw at each other over a stick of red wax. The absurdity was not lost on anyone. American camp reports often noted such quarrels, attributing them to stress and the breakdown of hierarchy. But to the prisoners, these moments cut deep, echoes of the rigid structures they thought had collapsed with the Reich. The statistics underlined how fragile order could be. With one guard for every 30 to 40 captives, discipline inside the barracks often relied on self-policing. Leaders emerged naturally, sometimes mirroring Nazi ranks, other times fractured by resentment. In female camps, cosmetics and clothing sharpened these divides more than food did. The items symbolized not just beauty, but power. Who could command respect? Who could still feel like more than a number? One woman snapped during an interrogation, asterisk, "We fought harder for lipstick than bread," asterisk. The line was later quoted in camp records, shocking American officers who assumed hunger would dominate all disputes. But for the women, Lipstick and dresses were more than luxuries.
They were weapons against erasure, reminders that they were still themselves, and those who controlled them wielded influence within the wire. The guards, mostly 19 and 20-year-olds, found themselves puzzled spectators. They had been trained to watch for escape attempts, sabotage, or political resistance, not rivalries over cosmetics. Some leaned on the fence, trading cigarettes for stories, quietly amused. Others shook their heads, baffled at how quickly status could reform in captivity. Soon, curiosity turned into fascination. The guards began to see these women less as faceless prisoners and more as unpredictable individuals, defying every stereotype the war had taught them. That shift in perception would open doors neither side expected. Starting with small exchanges across the barbed wire, the quarrels inside the barracks had not gone unnoticed. From the watchtowers and wire posts, the young American guards watched the women argue, laugh, and barter. At first, it was entertainment, a break from the monotony of duty. But slowly, curiosity took root. These weren't faceless enemies anymore. They were women who sang in German, stitched uniforms into makeshift dresses, and fought over lipstick like sisters in a household. For guards barely out of high school, the scene felt both alien and familiar. Most were only a few years younger than the prisoners. Records show the average GI overseeing POW camps in 1945 was just 19 to 21 years old, barely trained in foreign languages, carrying rifles more for show than threat. To them, the German women were not dangerous soldiers, but strange guests behind barbed wire. Some guards began trading a cigarette slipped for a song, a chocolate bar swapped for a sketch of an American Jeep. These small transactions carried no official sanction, but they became daily rituals. The women, too, sensed the shift. They had expected hostility, yet found a mix of amusement and sympathy in the eyes of their keepers. One recalled later, "They treated us more gently than our own men." The sentence landed heavily in post-war accounts, a quiet admission that shattered years of propaganda. For women used to harsh discipline from German officers, the light touch of these boyish guards seemed surreal. At night, the exchanges deepened. A guard would ask for a German lullaby, leaning against the fence, while the women sang softly under the barracks lamp. Others requested handwriting samples, fascinated by the sharp angles of German script. These were not grand gestures, but tiny bridges built out of boredom and humanity. For the prisoners, every cigarette or smile blurred the line between enemy and captor. For the guards, the line blurred, too, between duty and simple human curiosity. Yet, these small encounters carried risks. Officers higher up warned against fraternization, and suspicion grew that guards might be manipulated. Still, the nightly hum of German voices drifted across the compound, unpunished, unnoticed by anyone who didn't want to notice. That curiosity would soon expand beyond cigarettes and songs. As weeks passed, the camp discovered ways to occupy the women, ways that transformed idle hours into moments of creativity, sewing, and games that gave captivity a rhythm neither side had anticipated. Afternoons in the camp began to follow a pattern. After roll call and chores, guards opened the yard gates, allowing prisoners to spill into open spaces. Some headed to the sports field, where a tattered ball bounced against the dust. Others gathered in shaded corners, bent over needles and thread. Recreation was not just a luxury, it was policy. The Americans believed activity kept order, so they supplied kits, sewing needles, yarn, and scraps of fabric pulled from quartermaster stores. The women seized on it. Oversized men's uniforms were cut apart, reshaped into crude skirts or blouses. Sleeves became sashes. Trouser legs became makeshift dresses. The camp soon looked less like a barracks and more like a workshop. The air filled with the rhythmic pull of thread through cloth. For some, it was a return to normalcy. For others, it was quiet rebellion. Each stitch was a reminder that identity could be remade, even in captivity. The numbers underline the intent. US records note that prisoner camps across the country distributed hundreds of sewing kits and sports items, from baseballs to chessboards. It was a strategy of control, but to the women, it became a lifeline. The thud of boots on a field and the scrape of scissors on fabric replaced silence and despair. Photographs show German women laughing in yards, holding sewing patterns up to the sun, as if reimagining themselves piece by piece. One prisoner later admitted, asterisk, "We reshaped men's clothes into our own. Asterisk, the act carried weight far beyond fabric." In Germany, their identities had been consumed by uniforms and war work. In captivity, creativity offered a fragile reclaiming of womanhood. Even guards found themselves pausing to watch, amused by the sight of prisoners parading patched-together skirts along the wire. The yard filled with contrasts, one group playing volleyball, another humming folk songs as they cut cloth, a third arguing over thread colors. It was captivity, but it was also a strange echo of civilian life. Stitched together from scraps of an enemy's abundance, the effect was both haunting and hopeful, a reminder that life insisted on pushing forward, even behind fences. But whispers soon spread. Rumors that real dresses, proper garments, not stitched uniforms, were on their way. Whether true or not, anticipation rippled through the camp. When the day came, the surprise proved greater than any rumor could have promised. The rumor turned into reality on a clear morning when a Red Cross truck rattled into the compound. The women gathered near the fence, expecting food parcels or medical supplies. Instead, crates were lowered and pried open with crowbars. Inside were stacks of folded cotton and floral prints, actual dresses, stitched in US factories and shipped thousands of miles. The sight froze the prisoners in silence. For years, they had worn only uniforms, patched rags, or men's cast-offs. Now, garments from another world were being handed out, one by one. Fingers brushed fabrics that felt impossibly soft compared to coarse wool. Some women pressed the dresses against their faces, inhaling the scent of fresh cloth and soap. Others held them up to the light, stunned by the patterns, roses, checks, even pale stripes. To those who had forgotten what it meant to be seen as women, the shock bordered on painful. Reports from camp inventories confirmed that hundreds of garments were delivered to prisoner compounds through Red Cross aid in 1945. While numbers varied, the effect was consistent: sudden bursts of joy, disbelief, and rivalry. For the Americans, this was routine welfare distribution. For the women, it was an earthquake of identity. One German prisoner whispered, asterisk, "We look like women again, not soldiers." Asterisk, the phrase captured the rupture. In the Reich, they had been auxiliaries and cogs in a crumbling machine. In US captivity, dresses returned them to a role they had been denied by war. Some laughed nervously, parading awkwardly in new clothes while boots clumped beneath. Others folded theirs neatly, unwilling to wear them in front of guards. The transformation did not go unnoticed. Guards stood along the fence, nudging each other, surprised at how swiftly the atmosphere shifted. What had been a grey crowd in baggy uniforms now glimmered with patches of color. Even prisoners who refused to wear the dresses felt the tension of choice pressing on them. For a brief moment, the camp no longer looked like a military compound. It resembled a small-town Sunday gathering. The true shock came not in the yard, but in the quiet of evening. Dressed in cotton prints and clutching lipstick, the women began walking the fenced paths, their footsteps measured, their heads high. What began as handouts turned into ritual, the Sunday stroll, and it unsettled both captives and guards alike. Sunday afternoons changed the atmosphere inside the wire. Once chores were complete and roll call dismissed, women emerged from barracks, not in shapeless uniforms, but in cotton dresses. The fabrics were light, floral, sometimes striped, a jarring contrast to the drab olive and grey that had defined their lives for years. Boots clumped beneath hemmed skirts, belts cinched awkwardly. But for the first time, the campyard resembled something like a promenade. Guards leaned against fences, arms folded, watching the spectacle unfold. The ritual became predictable. Women would gather in twos or threes, pacing the gravel paths inside the perimeter. They talked softly, sometimes laughed, occasionally sang. From the towers, the guards could hardly believe what they saw. An enemy that only months earlier had worn swastikas, now walking in dresses under American watch. It looked less like captivity and more like some surreal suburban gathering transplanted into barbed wire. Sources indicate that Sunday was the designated recreation day in many US camps, marked by music, games, and relaxed supervision. Here, it became a catwalk of sorts. Photographs from similar compounds show prisoners holding parasols fashioned from scraps or adjusting handmade sashes. To the women, it was a fragile reclaiming of normalcy. To the guards, it was uncanny, prisoners looking freer than civilians in war-torn Europe. One auxiliary admitted later, asterisk, We looked freer than civilians at home. Asterisk. The line cut to the heart of the paradox. Behind wire, they had regular meals, clean clothes, even moments of leisure. Outside in Germany, their families faced rubble, hunger, and despair. The guilt and relief of this realization lingered with every Sunday stroll, and beyond the fence, local civilians sometimes gathered, drawn by curiosity. Farmers, wives, children, and townspeople stood at a distance, watching the strange procession of German women circling in dresses. Some stared in silence, others whispered disapproval. To the prisoners, the stares carried weight. They were both spectacle and ghost, neither civilians nor soldiers, walking in loops that led nowhere. The strolls unsettled everyone in different ways. Guards laughed, civilians gawked, and prisoners questioned what freedom even meant. Yet, this odd ritual laid the groundwork for something larger. Soon, the gaze of civilians outside the wire would shift from curiosity to contact, and with it, the camp's boundaries blurred in ways no guardrail could fully control. Word spread quickly in the nearby town. Farmers driving wagons past the camp slowed to glimpse the strange sight: German women in dresses, strolling behind barbed wire as if on holiday. On Sundays, families gathered along the perimeter roads, children perched on fence posts, wives clutching baskets. They stared at the prisoners, not with fear, but with uneasy fascination. For small-town America, the war had felt distant ration books, draft lists, letters from sons overseas. Now its enemy was walking in plain sight, laughing in cotton prints. The first reactions were disbelief. Housewives whispered, wondering why prisoners were allowed such comfort. Some muttered that their own closets held less after years of rationing. Yet curiosity softened judgment. Town records and oral histories describe locals lingering for hours, watching the women promenade as if the camp had become a theater. The prisoners, self-conscious under so many eyes, straightened their posture, turning every lap around the yard into a performance. The statistics underscore the scale of contact. Many U.S. camps house 2,000 or more prisoners, often within a mile or two of rural communities. Barbed wire separated captives from civilians, but only just. Children pressed faces to the fence, trading names with women who replied in halting English. Farmers noted their wives asking questions. Were these truly the same Germans who had bombed London, who had marched across Europe? The contradiction gnawed at assumptions. One auxiliary recalled, asterisk, "We were stared at like creatures from another world." Asterisk. The gaze carried weight, half curiosity, half judgment. Some prisoners felt humiliated, turned into spectacles. Others saw opportunity, softening their expressions, trying to appear less threatening, more human. The exchanges became subtle negotiations of image, played out through the simple act of walking in circles. Not all civilian disapproved. Some were drawn closer, compelled to bridge the distance. It began with small gestures, a nod, a smile, a child slipping a wildflower through the wire. Guards noticed, but often looked the other way. The camp's rigid order had cracked, and through that crack, human contact began to filter, and soon, the gifts became tangible. Apples, handkerchiefs, and scraps of food passed through the wire. What began as staring turned into sharing, shifting the boundaries of captivity once more. It began almost imperceptibly. A child pushed an apple through the wire, giggling before his mother pulled him back. A few days later, a farmer's wife slipped a folded handkerchief into a guard's hand with a whispered request to pass it along. Before long, these gestures became routine. German women emerged from barracks with cautious smiles, waiting to see what might appear between fence posts. The gifts were small fruit, scraps of bread, sewing patterns torn from magazines, but each carried enormous weight inside the camp. The exchanges took on ritual form. Civilians lingered outside the fence on weekends, parcels tucked under shawls. Guards often pretended not to notice, their eyes fixed elsewhere as hands moved quickly. Some even facilitated the transfers, curious themselves to watch how the women reacted. A handkerchief embroidered with flowers sparked laughter in one barrack. An apple was sliced into slivers and shared among 6. Every gift carried meaning, proof that the enemy could also be neighbor. Official records logged hundreds of civilian contacts near U.S. POW camps in 1945, often described as unauthorized fraternization. Authorities worried about security breaches, yet the items that passed the wire were rarely contraband. Instead, they were tokens of normal life recipes, scraps of fabric, even music sheets. For women stripped of civilian identity, These tokens felt like messages from another world. One auxiliary later asked bitterly, "Why did they share with enemies?" The question carried both confusion and gratitude. German propaganda had painted Americans as brutal, vengeful, and unforgiving. Yet here, small-town wives and children offered gifts more gently than their own officers ever had. The paradox forced reflection and whispered conversations long after lights out. Not all prisoners welcomed the exchanges. Some worried the gifts created debts, invisible strings tying them to their captors. Others felt shame, taking food while their families starved in Germany. Yet most accepted, unable to deny the relief of tasting an apple or holding cloth, softer than any uniform. The fence became less a barrier and more a market of human contact, fragile and unrecorded. With every apple and handkerchief, another question grew louder inside the camp. If kindness existed on this side of the wire, what did that mean about everything they had been told before capture? Reflections spread like fire, carried by whispers under bunks. Nights in the barracks grew heavier with questions. The women lay on their bunks, staring at the wooden ceilings, whispering in German about the day's gestures. Apples, fabric, a smile from across the wire. These were small things, yet they gnawed at the foundations of what they had believed. For years, propaganda reels had hammered a single image. Americans were greedy, corrupt, barbaric. But here, in captivity, they were being fed, clothed, and even offered kindness. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Interrogation records reveal that 25 to 30% of German POWs showed ideological shifts during captivity. For women, those shifts often came not from pressure but from daily dissonance. They compared their lives in the Reich-bombed cities, ration cards, harsh officers to the strange abundance and civility of US camps. Conversations became confessions. If this is our enemy, what have we been fighting for? Others resisted, clinging harder to the party line, but cracks widened all the same. One auxiliary admitted later, "We were fed lies about Americans." It was a stark acknowledgement that echoed across diaries and oral histories. The women debated under their breath. Had Germany lost because of betrayal, or because the enemy was simply stronger industrially, materially, even morally? The questions carried danger. To voice them too loudly was to risk accusations of weakness. Yet silence only made the contradictions grow louder. The guards noticed the change in atmosphere. Where once the women had been hostile, now they asked tentative questions about towns, farms, or even Hollywood films. Some stared at magazines passed through the wire, comparing the smiling faces of American women with their own reflection in broken mirrors. For a brief moment, they could imagine a different world, one not dictated by uniforms and fear. But cracks also hurt. With every parcel of food, the guilt of survival deepened. They thought of families starving in Hamburg or Cologne, children shivering in cellars while they received chocolate and dresses in captivity. The realization twisted every bite into both comfort and shame. Captivity offered clarity, but it also magnified the weight of loss. The tension gratitude laced with guilt marked the beginning of a deeper transformation. Yet the war outside the fences was not finished, and soon orders would come that would force the women to confront a final rupture, leaving the relative safety of American captivity for the ruins of home. By late 1945, orders filtered into the camps. Repatriation. The word stirred both relief and dread. For months, the women had built routines, showering, receiving parcels, sewing circles, Sunday strolls. Now, they were told it was ending. Trucks would come not to bring them to another American compound, but to carry them eastward, back across the ocean, back to a homeland most barely recognized anymore. Packing began quietly. The dresses were folded carefully, lipstick tubes hidden deep in bags, as though carrying proof that captivity had not erased them. Departure day arrived with the same rattling engines that had once brought them in. The women filed into convoys, this time with straighter posture and heavier silence. Guards, many of them barely older than the prisoners, watched with a mix of relief and regret. Official records note that by 1946, millions of German POWs were shipped back to Europe through ports like New York and Boston, their journeys stretching across months. For these women, the process was slower, often tangled in paperwork and the politics of post-war Europe. On the road to embarkation, they glimpsed a world at peace, children running in open fields, Shop windows filled with goods, American towns untouched by bombing. The contrast cut deep. They realized that captivity had shown them abundance, but freedom meant return to ruins. Some whispered prayers, others clutched dresses like lifelines. Every mile eastward pulled them further from the strange security of barbed wire and closer to cities flattened by Allied bombs.